Now turn to part 3. You will hear 5 short extracts in which people are talking about different walks planned for the guests of a hotel. For questions 19 to 23, choose from the list A to H which statement applies to each walk. Use the letters only once. There are 3 extra letters which you do not need to use. You now have 30 seconds to look at part 3. Speaker 1.
Walk 1 will take us along Redwood Dale and up Scafell Peak. Don't let that worry you, it's quite a gentle slope really, and we're only going halfway up. I should mention that the ground tends to be rather rocky, so a pair of stout walking shoes and a warm coat are required, as it gets a little chilly on the way up. But once there, I can assure you that you will find the view magnificent and well worth the effort.
Speaker 2.
Walk 2 doesn't involve any climbing uphill. We'll stroll along the bank of the River Swale, passing the local fishermen and canoeists. Our destination will be Mappin Isle, a half-mile or so down the river. Local pleasure boats will ferry us across to the island, where a nature reserve has been created and we can wander at leisure to view the large range of wildlife.
Speaker 3. Walk 3 takes us in the opposite direction, but along the bank of the same river to the Rothwell Fish Farm. Here you will see modern fish farming methods in operation. Part of the River Swale has been cordoned off, and a variety of fish is bred here for both ecological and commercial purposes. We'll be shown around the fish farm by a guide, and all your questions relating to the production of fish here will be answered. Speaker 4.
Walk 4 takes us to the historic village of Wentworth, and we stroll along the cobbled lanes of a remarkably unspoilt village, where traditional handicrafts, which in other places have long ceased to exist, still survive. There'll be plenty of time in which to purchase souvenirs, and we'll stop for a bite to eat and something to drink before returning to the hotel.
Speaker 5. Finally, Walk 5 leads us to Sparsworth Caves. A short descent beneath the surface, and we find ourselves in the subterranean world of beautiful rock formations, stalactites, and stalagmites. Please don't think you'll return with a sore back. Since the caves are so spacious, it's hardly necessary to bend your head more than once or twice. A quiet, dark world, but also a marvelously impressive one. Now turn to part 4. You will hear an interview with the food historian, Sam Clark, about the history of bread. For questions 24 to 30, choose the best answer, A, B, or C. You now have 1 minute to look at part 4. This morning I have Sam Clark, a food historian, in the studio to tell us about the history of bread. So Sam, welcome to the show. I think a good place to start would be the beginning. Where was bread invented?
We don't really know who were the very first people to make bread, and perhaps it was invented in many places more or less at the same time. But what we do know for certain is that humans have been making bread for at least 30,000 years. The very first types of bread were a sort of paste made from grains and water that were flattened out and left to dry. They were probably quite similar in some ways to the Middle Eastern flatbreads that are still eaten today.
So the fluffier breads with yeast that we eat today are a modern invention?
Oh, not at all. Bread made with yeast has been around for thousands of years, and we know exactly where it was invented. Sourdough bread, which was the first type of bread that had yeast to make it rise, was invented in ancient Egypt, but it probably happened by accident, from natural airborne yeasts that settled on some bread dough that was sitting in a warm place.
Sourdough bread is still made today, isn't it?
Yes, it's still regarded as the most traditional form of bread making even today. It's very tasty, and many people think it's healthier than other lighter kinds of bread. At one time it was the only type of bread available until commercial yeasts were produced. But even though modern breads are much lighter, there are still many bakers around the world using traditional sourdough recipes.
So how did bread with yeast spread from Egypt to the rest of the world?
Well, Egyptian bakers passed their skills on to the ancient Greeks because the two cultures were in close contact. Then the Greeks passed those skills on to the Romans. It was the Romans who more or less spread the art of making yeasted sourdough breads throughout Europe while they were busy building up the Roman Empire.
How is the history of bread important to us as a society, apart from just being interesting?
It's extremely important. When we stopped being hunter-gatherers who travelled in small bands looking for food and became farmers, growing cereals that were used to make bread, it meant that humans could live in settled communities, and that the populations of these communities could grow because we could feed large numbers of people easily. In effect, the history of bread is the history of civilization.
What about the symbolic significance of bread?
In many cultures and religions throughout the world, bread has huge symbolic importance. It's a symbol of sharing with others. Sharing the bread around a table marks the beginning of the meal. I think the main reason this is so important is that for large parts of human history, people have been very hungry as a result of famine, crop failures and wars. Without our daily bread, many of us would still go very hungry. It's a symbol of family and security.
Do people still eat as much bread as they used to?
In the developed world, it certainly isn't as important to our diet today as it was, say, in the Middle Ages, where it was our main source of nutrients for the day. But we still do eat quite a lot of bread. Toast is still a favourite for breakfast, as are sandwiches for lunch. We also now have a massive choice of types of bread to buy, from the traditional flatbreads or sourdough to the sophisticated baguette or brioche.
It's actually a really fascinating subject, isn't it? I'm really surprised.